Hey guys, it's James with the Ought podcast. Today I'm going to talk about Anselm's of Canterbury's Ontological Argument. Today's date is 3/13/2026, and uh, kind of like if you've never heard of this argument before, I will, give you I'll just read verbatim what it is, and then I'll give it a summary, because when you read it verbatim from the source, it could be a little hard to read, but we'll just go over like a more simpler version of the read, and then I'll give the classical responses for it, and then I'm going to give my 2 cents on it, and then I'm going to repurpose this. And the reason why I'm going to repurpose this argument is I think, in the grand scheme of things, this is the most humble thing I can say is I don't think it is a compelling argument. And I think that there are much better arguments for the existence of God. I just think the ontological is just uh, one of the least compelling. But the reason why I want to speak about it is because I want to repurpose it. So I'm going to, we will derive an ought from it at the end. Um, I'm going to change it from from the philosophy of religion, where I think it's not a great argument. I'm going to repurpose it to a different philosophy, and I'm going to present that to you guys, and you can, pros and cons it. None of it's going to be earth shattering. There are greater thinkers than I. Surely I'm not smarter than Thomas Aquinas nor Kant, and both of these guys were critical of this argument. So obviously, you know, you will decide ultimately, but maybe the way I present it might be of interest to you. But I see this argument pop up every now and then, in my meanderings of the internet, and I want to have this video so when people are like, "Oh, this is such a wonderful argument," and they start, and I can just redirect here. So if if I've posted a link to you, hi, it's wonderful to meet you. And this is going to be my response to specifically the ontological argument. And for those of you who feel that you must defend all things Christian, again, I just don't like this argument. That doesn't mean that I don't like other arguments for the existence of God, and I don't mean to say Christian. For those of you who feel you must defend all things God, I'm sorry. That's what I really meant to say. Just like the arguments I find the most compelling is going to be like William Lane Craig's, Kalam cosmological argument. I think, fine tuning arguments are fine. And I think that uncaused causer, unmoved mover, the Aristotelian arguments are going to be fine. So Thomas Aquinas, again, like it's all kind of along the path, but, when we are talking about like William Lane Craig, he incorporates that as well. But either way, I just want to give, pointers to where I think that you have probably the best chance to make your argument. And I just think the ontological fails. So let's get into it. What is the ontological argument? So, verbatim, uh, when he hears of even a fool, when he hears of a being than which nothing greater can be conceived, understands what he hears, and what he understands is in his understanding, and assuredly that than which nothing greater can be conceived cannot exist in the understanding alone. For suppose it exists in the understanding alone, then it can be conceived to exist in reality, which is greater. Therefore, if that than which nothing greater can be conceived exist is the understanding alone, the very being than which nothing greater can be conceived is one than which a greater can be conceived. But obviously, this is impossible. Hence, there is no doubt that there exists a being than which nothing greater can be conceived, and it exists both in the understanding in reality. So, if you followed that, great. But if you didn't, that's okay. Kind of like the way to look at this is, core premises is existence is greater than effectively imaginary, or things in the line. It is greater for something to exist both in the mind and in reality than to exist in the mind alone. Obviously, the contradiction. If the greatest conceivable being existed only in the mind, we could conceive of an even greater being, one that also exists in reality. The conclusion, since it is impossible to conceive of something greater than the greatest conceivable being, this being God, must exist. This is impossible. Yeah. Um, so, uh, kind of like the initial response to this was, I think, kind of how you imagine. I don't think people were instantly compelled, but so the first major criticism comes from a contemporary of his, and that's Guanillo. And he argued, he basically just did the exact same thing, only he used, a perfect island instead. So if you see like a response like, greatest conceivable island, you could say greatest conceivable pizza, and these are all ad absurdums. It's just designed to show you, bro, you could do this with anything. That's why it's not compelling. It loses its argumentative power when you use the exact same mechanism to force into being all perfect things that you can possibly imagine, not just God. And when you do that with like kind of absurd things like a perfect island or a pizza or a unicorn, you're mostly teasing the argument, like, and teasing in the literal joking sense. I'm teasing you on this. It's for some people it can be very infuriating. You could be like, it's not what you know. And I think Anselm, his response is to simply say, God is in a category of his own. Unlike, an island can always be improved upon, is his response. Whereas God cannot, because that's God is definitionally perfect. And he leaves it at that. The next um, uh, challenge, I would say, is Thomas Aquinas. Thomas Aquinas argues that humans cannot fully grasp God's essence, so we cannot use the definition of God to prove his existence. Um, this is the camp I am primarily in. I'm primarily with Thomas Aquinas on that. And so when we get into I will expand upon that more verbosely than what Thomas Aquinas' line there says, just to make so we can really drive home that point. But I agree with Thomas Aquinas there, honestly. And then Kant just makes it pretty simple. Kant just argues that existence is not a great making property or attribute that can be added to a concept to make it greater. It is simply the state of a concept being exemplified in the world. You know, uh, the or it's predicate, right? Like so, you'll see those arguments pop up in the comment sections of these um, uh, ontological videos. They'll just basically repeat Kant, but like I said, I'm quite taken with Thomas Aquinas, his response to this, especially. And I think Thomas Aquinas represents basically the gold standard for arguments for God's existence and his Summa Theologica and his five ways. So I'm not saying I love all of his five ways. I'm not a fan of his fourth way at all. But still, though, I think that in classical thinking for arguments for God's existence, I think he's the gold standard, especially at least for Christian God's existence. I think he does the best attempt, and so that's where I would direct people. If you're looking for great arguments for God, go there. William Lane Craig, you know, um, fine tuning arguments. Those are going to be probably your strongest, most compelling arguments. Understand that any of these arguments should not leave you with a degree of ultimate certainty. You should never say to yourself, I am 100 this, any argument on God's existence leaves me with 100% certainty. I would say that is a mistake. You have many great believers who are not 100%. They can be like 99. They can be high levels of certainty, but not absolute certainty. So my friends, all I would ask is just don't make that mistake. But like I said, there are better arguments than the ontological, and I just don't like the ontological. I just think it's, like I said, I just think it's kind of a bad argument. It's just, I think when you initially hear it, even right, like You sort of know. Like the first time you hear it, you're just kind of like, ah, that's bad. It takes someone else to tell you, no, 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 circle back to it and try again. Like you just didn't think about it hard enough, right? To try to get you, like to try to rope you into it. You have to have enough people to try to convince you this really is a good argument to start to maybe move you onto thinking it's a good argument. But I think that if you really think about it, um, it just starts collapsing again. There's a kind of a ludicrous premise baked into it, right? I think it's a quite a valid criticism to simply say you're defining God into existence. You know, and some of the stuff I also think about when we talk about uh, actual is greater than inactual, things in reality are greater than things in the mind. Um, I would, easy way to kind of point out like some silly things right away. We can imagine there are things that are in the mind that have greater value, that are greater to us than material things. Like for instance, if you're married or if you have children or if you have parents that you love, then that's going to be the key. Love, right? So love is not physically intangible. I mean, we could say chemicals in the brain is physical tangible, but the effects of those chemicals, right? Can that be measured like on your subjective mind? I would say not. I would say that there is some change over there that's not fully understood. Like it's one thing to say here's a chemical, it's another thing to feel the effects of said chemical. And while you could say, well, that's just the effects of said chemical, it could be quite powerful. And, regardless if you believe in free will or not, it is quite the experience that makes life, quite interesting. I think we can all at least agree on that, no matter where you are. So even my material determinist friends can at least say, yeah, sure, it can be quite pleasant. It can also be quite pain inducing, but I think that we can at least agree that the effect of love, the effect of these things can be quite powerful on our emotional state. So whether or not you chose it or not is irrelevant. So when I think about that, now we could say that's a categorical mistake, right, on my part to sit here and say, well, you're comparing love to a rock. It's not exactly apples to oranges. But what I'm trying to say is that there are mental objects or mental states that we value greatly, and there are things in reality, tangible things in reality that we don't value very much. And so I think when we're thinking about saying things like, things in reality are greater than things in, you could say like, well, if love was tangible, love would be greater if it was tangible than if it was just a mental state. But I don't actually, I don't think that makes any sense either, honestly. So even if we were to try to do apples to apples, I don't think, love in tangibly is going to be any more or less than love as a mental state, right? So I don't, like I said, I think there's some things that we could find to kind of show that even definitionally, I think this is a little silly. Now, to really kind of expand upon Thomas Aquinas and why I fully agree with him here, when I've really spent some time kind of talking about this, I think the primary issue is that with Thomas Aquinas, like if we imagine God in our minds, we are not imagining the God Thomas Aquinas imagines. What Thomas Aquinas imagines God to be is going to be in the omnis, omnipotent, omniscient, omnibenevolent. Those are the omnis. So if you see people talking about the three omnis, that's what they're talking about. They're talking about those three terms right there. So all knowing, all powerful, all loving. Those are the three omnis. What does all mean? In Thomas Aquinas's view, infinite. And I think in almost every philosopher, when you are defining God, you are going to say God is infinite. Let's say God is not infinite. Let's say I disagree with you, James. God is a finite being. Okay. Is Thor in the MCU, in your mind, truly a god? Truly a god? Is Superman, in your mind, truly a god? Is Thanos with the Infinity Stones, in your mind truly a god? Not to belabor the point, but we can take this to Super Saiyans. They've hit God status in Super Saiyan, and yet these gods are fighting, they're Super Saiyan God, and yet they're fighting Beerus, the god of destruction, and they can beat each other up. Is one god mightier than the other? Is Beerus, or is the Omni King God? You know, um, right? He's pretty powerful. I will say that. I think it's super powerful. But that's probably the closest thing you're going to see to God in the Dragon Ball Z universe. But would we still say that childlike being is God? Would we really think that? You know, um, I don't think. I think we could. Could we imagine? Here's a good thing to imagine. Could you imagine any of the beings that I've mentioned and make and add +1 to any of their stats? Like, think of a D&D character. Like, could you imagine the Omni King with just a little bit more strength, or a little bit more knowledge, or a little bit more love? You know what I mean? Or any characteristic. Maybe he's just prettier. Could you imagine the Omni King being a prettier being? Or whatever being you think is the most powerful being you can possibly imagine. Could you imagine it just a slightly bigger? And if you can you then imagine that new form slightly bigger? And if you can you imagine that new form slightly bigger? And if you can, ad absurdum, it infinitely, right? And that's the challenge. Like, no one can imagine infinite, right? Like, so when we get to like the kind of classical definitions of God, we're trying to imagine infinite, and our brains are finite. No one can imagine infinite. Heck, no one can honestly. Could you really honestly imagine our solar system? I think when we imagine our solar system, we kind of imagine concepts of the solar system, like, okay, here's the sun, and here's the orbits of all the planets kind of around it. But aside from what you saw in books, can you imagine it in reality? Like, really put the solar system, just our solar system. How many rocks are in our asteroid belt? Do you know that number? Do you know how much dust is floating around in our solar system? Give me that number. And the reality is we're just like, how much dust? Uh, can you even imagine what a billion is? Can you imagine a billion? We can imagine a number. We can write a billion, but could you imagine what does a billion gold coins look like in your head? And do you think that's accurate? I mean, do you think it's accurate, really? Right? You know what I mean? Like, so I think even very large sums of things, which is not even in the infinite, is extremely hard to imagine. Like, imagine the whole universe. Pff, that's mind blowing. I can't do it. I can kind of imagine some concept of it, like that one picture with all the galaxies, and they just go, that one picture that we took of the darkest spot in space. We didn't think we'd see anything. It was just filled with galaxies, and we realized, holy cow, there are billions and billions of galaxies, and each galaxy has billions and billions of things in it. Just, you know, you can't truly imagine it, right? We can imagine like concepts. I can say I can imagine the concept of billions and billions and billions and billions, but I can't actually imagine billions. I can't even imagine a billion. It's just astronomically huge numbers, and my poor little finite brain just can't imagine it. Maybe a billionaire can say, well, I imagine $1 billion. I have a bank account that has $1 billion in it, and I go swimming in it every day, like Scrooge McDuck. Okay, that's cool. Can I see a video? You keep it. I don't want to steal it from you. Keep it. I just want to see it, man. Like, what does $1 billion look like? Just stacks and stacks of cash. Like, how many stacks? You could probably calculate it and maybe use a computer program, but just off the top of your head, can you imagine it? I can't. But, glory be to you if you can. I think the point has been belabored, and I think you understand the challenge there. And I think that's what Thomas Aquinas is trying to say, is simply like, whatever being you conjure in your head is ultimately going to be a finite being, and that finite being will always be infinitely dwarfed by an infinite God, the three omnis. And so in this way, like, when you try to bring that finite God into existence, and again, God is infinite. So, uh, And then also speaking about that greatest conceivable being, who's to say greatest conceivable being is perfect? Like, here's the thing to think about. What is the greatest conceivable James, going to do tomorrow? What would perfect James do tomorrow? Right? And we say, oh, well, you're not perfect. You've made all these mistakes prior to that. No, 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 no. Tomorrow is a new day. Tomorrow I can be perfect. I just have to imagine what would the greatest conceivable James do tomorrow and then do that thing. Would anybody agree I was perfect? Nah, y'all would say, no, in some minute way, you could have the greatest day of your life, but perfection, bro, your beard's not perfect. Like you've got this weird, white growth in your beard, not white growth, but, I should say, you can't really see it today, but I've got, my gray is coming in a streak, you know? So, I joke about my Navy days. So, any Marines and Navy guys that are out there, my military humor is still intact. Don't you worry. But uh, I think that we can agree that no matter how great of a day tomorrow is, how great of a person I am tomorrow, I'm not perfect, and you're not gonna ever agree in any way, shape, or form that I was perfect tomorrow. You would just challenge me and say, "Nah, dog, in some way you were imperfect." So, and I would agree with you. I can't even truly fathom perfection. I don't think anybody can. And so, even though you can say I define God as being perfect, but at the same time in this argument, I'm saying imagine the greatest conceivable being. You can't imagine perfection. So just in every way, this fails. Definitionally, and then mechanistically, it fails. You're just trying to define God into existence. But what is that God you're trying to define? Some finite weakling? No thanks. That's not my God, bro. Um, so I think that we can agree that it's not a great argument. And well, I shouldn't say that. I should say uh, this is why I am not compelled on this argument. So that's the humble way to say that. I apologize for my earlier arrogance in saying this fails. Anselm's ontological argument will continue on. It is not destroyed. The name of this video is not the ontological is destroyed, and we can throw it in the trash bin and never talk about it again. Some people are going to still argue for this thing. God bless. That's all I'm going to say on that. So then finally, how I repurpose this argument, what I truly think the value of the ontological argument is going to be, again, I kind of touched on it tomorrow. What is the greatest conceivable version of myself going to do tomorrow, right? And I use this a lot of times when I'm I have time to make decisions when when I realize that I'm grumpy or I'm being asked to do things I don't want to do. And it's a way for me to do things and make myself feel good about doing it. Right. So if my wife goes, "Hey, James, do you mind sweeping and mopping?" I may initially be like, oh, right, I don't want to do that. But I can take a moment and say, okay, what would the greatest conceivable husband do? Would the greatest conceivable husband just play video games and ignore his wife and, do those kind of things? Or would I just say, no, I like having a clean house and I like having a happy wife. So I'm going to get up and I'm going to sweep and mop, even though I don't want to, and if I do that, I think that is the greatest conceivable thing I can do in that moment. And then I can also take maybe a little bit of initiative. You know what? There's some dishes that I can clean. The stove needs to be cleaned, the counters need to be cleaned. And so maybe I do those things. And maybe my wife, she just sees that I've done these things without her having to nag me on them. And she goes, hey, thank you. And that makes me feel good. I feel like a better husband. And so I you know, have more positive outcomes, you know, um, and, because I'm making better decisions, right? So I think when we think about the ontological, I can imagine in my mind my greatest conceivable actions, and then premise two, me performing those actions, bringing them into reality, is greater than me just imagining cleaning my house and helping my wife, out on these tasks. Therefore, you know, helping, helping my wife and doing these tasks is greater, is the best thing to do. So there's a lot of ways, like you could say to yourself, isn't that basically like asking yourself, what would Jesus do? Right. Or for the atheists or non-believers, the, whatever you want to call them, they're just going to say, well, doesn't mindfulness do that? And I'm going to say, yeah, this is kind of like my inclusivist, side. I'm like, yeah, there's a lot of philosophies that land on the same hard ought, which is simply, think about, your actions and be mindful and try to say to yourself, what's the greater thing, but I would use this as an argument for mindfulness. I think that's where the ontological is going to shine, in a realm of mindfulness, because greatest conceivable is mental, it is mindfulness, like, because you have to stop and think, what is the greatest conceivable? And sometimes in a snap judgment, we're not going to think greatest conceivable moment. Even if you're trying to say, what would Jesus do, in a snap decision, when you're angry, someone's really making you mad, are you thinking of mild and meek Jesus, or are you thinking about the Old Testament wrathful God? Right. So we can, if we, and then later on we regret, I was a wrathful God and I wish I wasn't. I wish I was mild and meek, because I broke a lot of things that I didn't intend to break, right? So, not to say that you can't ever be wrathful and it be good. Sometimes you need to be, but I think that if we, a lot of times when we do things rashly, we end up regretting it. So I think that that's where we can derive some value, where we can get an ought from the ontological, and just simply say, this is a mindfulness argument. It's an argument for mindfulness. And so let's embrace that. Let's embrace more mindfulness. Let's try to recognize snap decisions. Anger is often out of a snap decision. For me, I recognize it. Like when I get really angry, I have a tendency to put myself into mental timeout. And I'm getting better at verbalizing that with my wife, where I'm just like, hey, I'm really frustrated. And sometimes I'm really mad, and I realize I'm being childishly mad. Like I'm mad because I just don't wanna, and those are like my most shame-filled moments, where I'm really just like, I'm acting like a child. I know I'm acting like a child, and I just need a moment to reorientate my mind and try to say, hey, you're acting like a child. I need to parent the inner child in my own head and fix myself. And the ontological, for me, helps me do that. I say to myself, James, what is the greatest husband, the greatest conceivable husband, going to do in this moment? Or what is the greatest conceivable friend going to do in this moment? What is the greatest, and sometimes that's what I need to do. I just need to ask myself those questions. And for some people, it's going to be, what would Jesus do? And for some people, it's going to be, I'm going to do some meditation. And until I've, gone back to there, all of these are, they're all different avenues to the same ought. And so maybe for you, good listener, that is going to be of help to you. And if it's not, hey, you know what? I'm sorry. You know, you don't have to like and subscribe. You have a choice. Or, if determinism is determinism, you don't have a choice, but you have the illusion of a choice. All right. I love any comments. I have a full-time job, so I'm not going to be as explosively creative as people who their podcast or their job. So I will try to read the comments on YouTube fairly regularly and try to keep up with them, but just know you're not going to have immediate engagement. So just keep that in mind. But thank you for everything, guys. Please make sure just tell me in the comments if you like it, if you hate it. Give me your 2 cents. I'd like to hear it. Again, in my previous videos, talk about Hegel. So this is my thesis. Hit me up with your antithesis. Either make a video and tell me why you hate everything I said, or if you just want to tweak some things, or go into comments and blow me up. Uh, just um, just know that uh, I have tried to be humble and authentic. So all I ask is humble and authenticity back, is all I'm going to ask. Thank you so much for your time, guys, and I'll see you on the flip side.